Have you ever seen a moment so powerful it silenced an entire airbase? They mocked him. They laughed at the old man in the faded jacket, thinking his time had passed, his knowledge worthless. But when the general's car screeched onto the tarmac and a 3-star officer raised his hand in salute, every smirk turned to shame. This is the story of Elias Vance, the ghost, a veteran they tried to forget, until the day respect returned in the most unforgettable way. Stay with me until the end, because once you hear what happened on that runway, you'll never look at veterans the same way again. And if you believe their stories deserve to be remembered, make sure to like this video, share it, and subscribe to Endless Stories. The August sun baked the runway at Fort Holloway until the asphalt shimmered like liquid. It was the kind of heat that pressed down on you, crawled into your lungs, and made the air taste like metal. On the far end of the airstrip sat a UH-1 Huey helicopter, silent and stubborn. Its olive drab paint was faded. Its rotor blades sagged like the wilted petals of a flower long past bloom. Around the machine swarmed a dozen young technicians, all in crisp coveralls, laptops balanced on portable tables, cables snaking into diagnostic ports. The screens glowed with neat lines of code and greenlit readouts. Every instrument claimed the same thing. Nothing was wrong. And yet, the Huey refused to start. Kyle Kramer, 26 years old, leaned against the skids, wiping sweat and grease onto a rag. He was the lead tech, proud of his spotless record and top-of-his-class credentials. But now, 6 hours into this mechanical standoff, his pride was souring into frustration. "Is this some kind of joke?" he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. He gave the helicopter's metal skin a sharp kick. The sound was flat, unsatisfying, and somehow insulting, like knocking on a coffin. A few of his crew chuckled. Others crossed their arms, frowning at the stubborn machine as if it were mocking them back. "Diagnostics say she's fine," Kramer said, holding up his tablet. "But the old bird doesn't care what the computer says. She's dead." Behind them, leaning against a fence in the sliver of shade, stood a man none of them knew. He was tall but wiry, with white hair that clung to his head in an uneven cloud. His denim jeans were worn pale, his olive-green jacket so faded it looked almost gray. His boots had seen miles of dirt roads and jungles, not clean hangar floors. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just watched the Huey with an intensity that unsettled some of the younger techs when they caught his gaze. His pale blue eyes seemed fixed not on the machine as it was, but as it had once been, or maybe as it still was, beneath its silence. Lieutenant Wells, the officer in charge, spotted him and strode over, his posture stiff, his jaw tight. Wells was fresh out of officer school, his uniform still sharp, his authority still shiny. "Sir," he said, the title more formality than respect, "this is a restricted area. You can't just stand here watching." The old man finally shifted his gaze. His voice, when it came, was low and gravelly, like stones tumbling in a stream. "General Michelson sent for me. Name's Elias Vance." Wells blinked, thrown off for half a second. Then Kramer overheard and barked a laugh. He swaggered over, rag in hand, grease streaking his wrist. "Wait, you're the guy the general pulled out of retirement?" He looked Eli up and down, unimpressed. "We've got certified avionics specialists here. 3 master mechanics. Direct line to the manufacturer's engineers. And they call you?" A couple of the younger techs snickered. One whispered, "Publicity stunt," and another muttered, "Museum piece." Eli didn't rise to it. He turned back to the helicopter, his head tilting slightly as if listening for something only he could hear. "I'm just here to look," he said. Kramer scoffed. "Look? We've been looking for 6 hours. Continuity's perfect. Fuel's clean. Ignition has power. Every sensor is green. The system says she should fly." He tossed his rag onto a toolbox. "But she won't, because she's done. She's a corpse." Eli's eyes softened, and for the first time, he let a hint of sadness edge into his voice. "She's not dead. She's quiet. There's a difference." The younger men laughed louder this time, But something about Eli's tone made Airman Peterson, the youngest of the group, glance at him twice. There was no arrogance in the old man's words, only certainty. Kramer waved him off. "Okay, Pops. You want to stand there and listen for ghosts, go right ahead. We'll handle the real work." Eli began a slow walk around the Huey. He didn't touch her, not yet. His hands stayed tucked in his jacket pockets. His steps were deliberate, almost ritualistic. He crouched by the tail boom, studied the rotor mast, leaned close to an access panel no one else had given more than a glance. To the techs, it looked like nothing more than an old man pacing circles. To Peterson, it looked like reverence. From the corner of his eye, Wells checked Eli's file on a tablet. "Vietnam veteran," he murmured to Kramer. "Crew chief." Kramer rolled his eyes. "So what?" "He knows how to patch bullet holes in the jungle." "We're not in a jungle, Lieutenant. We're on a modern airbase with tech worth more than his house." Eli stopped at the portside engine cowling. His gaze lingered on a small access panel, barely noticeable under the bolts. He tilted his head, almost like he recognized an old scar. "What is it, Grandpa? You see a ghost?" Kramer smirked. Eli only murmured, "Something like that." But before he could say more, the lieutenant's radio crackled, and a furious voice demanded a status report. The delay was becoming a humiliation. Dignitaries were waiting in the viewing stands, growing restless. Kramer straightened, eager to defend his team's effort. Eli stayed silent, his eyes fixed on the Huey. The laughter of the young technicians still echoed across the runway. But in that moment, something had shifted. The old man wasn't laughing. He wasn't even offended. He was waiting for the moment when history would rise from the shadows and remind them all who he really was. The sun crawled lower, but the heat never relented. The air above the tarmac shimmered as if the entire base was caught inside a furnace. The Huey sat silent, its dull frame gathering dust and ridicule in equal measure. Kramer was in his element now, holding court among his fellow technicians. He wiped his hands, leaned on the Huey's skid, and nodded toward Eli, who was still circling the helicopter with slow, measured steps. "Look at him," Kramer said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "We've got state-of-the-art diagnostic systems running real-time checks, and he's walking around like some kind of medicine man. What's he going to do? Whisper to the bird until it flaps its wings." A ripple of laughter rolled through the crew. One of the younger techs chuckled. "Maybe he's casting a spell." Eli didn't look at them. He crouched near the tail boom, tracing lines with his eyes, not his fingers, as if reading invisible scars etched into the machine. His silence seemed to irritate them more than words ever could. Lieutenant Wells stood off to the side, arms crossed, his impatience bleeding into his tone. "Mr. Vance," he called out sharply, "we appreciate the sentiment, but as you can see, the team has it under control. There's nothing you'll find that our systems haven't already flagged." Eli finally straightened, his joints creaking faintly. He fixed Wells with pale blue eyes that carried the weight of jungles, monsoons, and firelit nights. "Your systems," he said softly, "don't know her." "I do." More laughter. Kramer threw up his hands. "You hear that, guys? Forget the spectrum analyzers, we just need a seance." This time, the laughter was louder, bolder, feeding on the lieutenant's silence. The air thickened with contempt, each joke a small dagger thrown at a man who had once risked everything without hesitation. Airman Peterson shifted uncomfortably at the edge of the group. He didn't laugh. Something about the old man unsettled him, not because Eli seemed out of place, but because he seemed too in place. Like he belonged with the Huey in a way none of them did. Eli ignored the noise. He stopped in front of a small, almost forgotten access panel just below the main exhaust port. He tilted his head, studying the flush of the bolts, the faint shadow of wear along the edges. To anyone else, it was just metal. To Eli, it was memory. He closed his eyes for a moment, and the tarmac dissolved into rotor wash and screaming radios. He was 20 again, crouched in the mud, bullets cracking overhead while he fumbled with that very panel. His knuckles bled, his ears rang. but he kept the bird alive long enough to lift men out of hell. The memory vanished, replaced by the distant echo of laughter. "Mr. Vance," Wells snapped, irritation sharp now. "We don't have time for nostalgia. If you're not going to contribute, I'll have security escort you off the flight line." Kramer grinned, sensing victory. "Yeah, Grandpa. We've got real work to do here." Eli looked from Wells to Kramer, then back to the Huey. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He only placed one weathered hand on the cool metal skin of the helicopter, almost like greeting an old friend. The laughter wavered then, just for a moment. Peterson felt a chill creep along his spine. He didn't know why, but the touch looked right, like the machine had been waiting for it. The others didn't notice. Their arrogance was too thick, their trust in the glowing green screens too absolute. They couldn't imagine that the man they mocked might carry knowledge beyond the reach of their technology. But Eli knew, and somewhere deep inside the silent Huey, something else seemed to know too. By mid-afternoon, the heat turned mean. It crawled into uniforms and under helmets, made tempers short and jokes sharper. The viewing stand on the far side of the airfield. White canvas, rows of folding chairs, a podium draped in flags, shimmered like a mirage. Somewhere a PA system popped and hissed as a captain rehearsed names for a ceremony that should have started an hour ago. The only thing not moving was the Huey. "Status," Lieutenant Wells barked without looking up from his tablet. Carl Kramer didn't bother to hide the edge in his voice. "Same. Power's good. Fuel's clean, sensors green. She's a statue." "Then make her not a statue," Wells said, "because officers run out of answers before they run out of authority." A ripple of uneasy laughter came from the techs. It died when they noticed the old man again. Still moving slowly along the fuselage, still not touching, still looking like he could hear something no one else could. He stopped at a low-access panel near the exhaust and stood so still that even the gnats seemed to orbit him like he was a pole set in the earth. Wells finally stalked over. "Mr. Vance, I asked you to remain outside the work area." The old man's eyes never left the panel. "You asked if I could help," he said quietly. "I'm trying to answer." Kramer pasted on a grin for the crew. "He's trying to answer a question from 1969. More laughter. One of the younger techs pantomimed turning a crank. Another muttered, "Call the museum. They'll want their exhibit back." Airman First Class Jamie Peterson didn't laugh. He stood a few paces behind Kramer, feeling the sun beat through his coveralls, thinking of his grandfather's careful hands rebuilding a tank carburetor on a kitchen table because the motor pool was closed on Sundays. The old man's silence felt familiar, like the long pauses his grandfather took before doing something that looked simple and turned out to be the difference between running and ruined. Wells' radio crackled. "Holloway Tower to Wells. Bring me a status for Colonel Hayes." The controller's voice carried the tightness people get when VIPs start glancing at watches. Wells thumbed the push-to-talk. "Lieutenant Wells, flight line. No start condition continues. Diagnostics inconclusive. We are escalating to level 3. "Copy," Tower said. Then after a beat, "Colonel wants to know why there's a civilian on his runway." A dozen eyes drifted to Eli Vance. Wells' mouth thinned. "Copy," he said again, and he lowered the radio like it had gotten heavier. Then he squared his shoulders and turned to the old man. "Mr. Vance, you are interfering with a military operation. I'm asking you one last time to step away from the aircraft." The old man looked at Wells the way a tree might look at an axe, without fear, without hurry measuring. "Son," he said, gentle as a warning, "you've got the right tools for the wrong problem." Kramer threw up his hands. "I can't with this." "Enough," Wells snapped. He gestured at an airman from security who'd been loitering in the shade. "Escort." "Sir," Peterson blurted before he could stop himself. Wells shot him a look that could peel paint. Peterson swallowed. "Sir, the general is expecting this bird to fly in front of half the state legislature. If Mr. Vance was sent by him, that's above your pay grade," Wells said. "And mine." He pointed at the security man again. "Escort." The security airman hesitated. Peterson stared at the old man's hands. Nicked knuckles, sun-spotted skin. the slow curl of fingers into a pocket where a small, battered leather pouch rode like a talisman. He didn't know why, but the sight made his chest ache. The base radio net is a jealous thing. It carries anger especially well. A new voice tore across the frequency, clipped and cold. Colonel Hayes for flight line. Put that civilian on a secure handset. Now. Wells blinked. He glanced around for a red-banded field phone, spotted one on the back of a maintenance cart, waved it over. Peterson was already moving, cable unreeling behind him. He handed the heavy handset toward Eli. "Sir," Wells said, reclaiming his steadiness, "you will keep this brief." Eli took the phone with both hands as if it might be delicate. He touched the rubber to his ear, and for a heartbeat the years went out of his face. Something young and fierce settled behind those pale eyes, the way a pilot's hands steady over a stick the instant the skids leave dirt. "Vance," he said, just the one word like a password. On the other end, miles away in an air-conditioned room hung with maps and framed photos, a door opened and closed with authority. A staff officer lowered his voice. Papers slid. A chair scraped. And then a voice that carried 3 stars without needing to say so came through the line. "Ghost," the general said. Peterson felt the hair lift on his arms. He looked around to see if anyone else had heard the nickname. The word seemed to hang in the hot air like the first drop before a storm. Kramer frowned, confused. Wells went very still. "Sir," Eli said. "What do you see?" the general asked. No preamble, no titles. The question of one professional to another at the edge of a problem. "A bird that's been told by a computer it's alive," Eli replied, and decided to believe the truth instead. Across the line, a low chuckle that held no humor. "They're laughing, aren't they?" "They're young," Eli said. "They trust what glows. They've never been lied to by a needle that stuck or a wire that hummed out a prayer." "And the panel?" the general asked, and for the first time his voice warmed, as if the 2 men were standing in the same cramped tent again with a lantern swinging and rain hammering canvas. "Still where we left it," Eli said. "Still not in any manual." Kramer leaned toward Wells, whispering, "What panel?" Wells didn't answer. He was staring at Eli the way you look at a photograph you've seen 100 times and suddenly recognize the person in the corner. "Ghost?" the general said, the word gentled by old memory. "Do I need to come down there?" "You don't need to, sir," Eli said. "But if you do, bring a car. It'll save you time." A brief, ragged silence. Then, "Stay put. Don't let anyone move that bird." Eli glanced at Wells. "Yes, sir," he said to the phone, then lowered it and held it out. He'd like to speak with the lieutenant. Wells took the handset as if it were hot. "Lieutenant Wells." "Lieutenant," the general said in a voice pitched to freeze a river. "In 2 minutes you will have the base commander on this line with me. In 10 minutes I will be on your tarmac. Between now and then you will not touch that aircraft, and you will not put a hand on Mr. Vance. If any of your people so much as sneer in his direction, you will be the loneliest officer in this state. Do you understand me?" The blood drained from Wells' face. "Yes, sir." "And, Lieutenant," the general added, softer and therefore worse, "if you don't know who you're standing next to, ask one of your older NCOs. Or better yet, don't. I'd like you to learn it the right way." The line clicked. Wells lowered the handset without quite remembering how. Around him the technicians tried to act as though they hadn't been listening with animal focus. Kramer forced a smirk that didn't quite find his mouth. "What was that about?" he asked too loudly. Peterson's phone buzzed in his pocket. A number he recognized from a training roster months back. Maj Davies. He stepped away from the group, thumbed it open, kept his voice low. "Airman Peterson. Are you with Vance?" the major asked, no time wasted. "Yes, sir." "Is he being treated with respect?" The word respect came out like a challenge more than a courtesy. Peterson watched Kramer toss his rag again. Saw the security airman look to Wells for a cue that didn't come. Saw Eli resting one palm against the Huey's skin, the way you touch a sleeping dog, so it knows you're there. "Not exactly, sir." On the other end, Peterson heard the scrape of a chair, the muffled call of orders moving through a room. Generals en route. Keep your head down. Keep your mouth shut. And airmen, thank you. The call ended. Peterson slid the phone away, heartbeat loud in his ears. He looked at Eli and found the old man studying him with a curiosity that had nothing to do with rank. You did right, Eli said. So softly Peterson wasn't sure the words had been for him. The airfield sounds returned in layers. A forklift beeping somewhere behind the hangars. A distant trainer jet winding up. The tin tap of a loose flag clip against a pole. Under all of it, the silence of the Huey took on a different weight. Not obstinate now, but expectant. Wells cleared his throat. We will await further instruction, he managed. He gestured vaguely, and the technicians drifted back a few steps, suddenly fascinated by their own shoes. Kramer sidled up to Peterson. What's his deal? He whispered, trying for derision and landing on uncertainty. Peterson shrugged, eyes never leaving Eli. Maybe ask the general when he gets here. General's not coming, Kramer scoffed. A siren yelped twice from the access road. Heads turned. Dust rolled in the heat shimmer beyond the far fence. 3 black vehicles took the turn faster than protocol liked, tires chirping as they straightened out and came arrowing across the sun-glared expanse. Kramer's mouth shut. Someone swore, softly and with reverence. Eli didn't move. His hand still rested on the old bird. His eyes were distant, not with pride and not with triumph, but with something like grief at the way time loops back on itself if you stand still long enough. He exhaled, a slow sound that might have been a prayer or just the body remembering how to ease out of a brace. Peterson didn't know why his throat tightened. He only knew that the name the general had used, Ghost, kept echoing in his head, filling all the space where jokes had been. The cars slid to a stop 20 yards away, doors snapping open in a choreography that came from long habit, not rehearsal. Men stepped out into the heat and into the story as if they'd been written in the first paragraph and were only now catching up to their lines. Wells swallowed. Kramer took a half step backward he didn't know he'd taken. The crew's laughter, hours old and suddenly ancient, felt like a stain on fresh paint. Some names survive the years because they are printed on plaques. Others because, when spoken into a bad phone on a hot runway, they make a general climb into a car and come running. Ghost, Peterson thought, tasting the word like a secret finally said aloud. Elias Vance. Across the concrete, the man in the faded olive jacket lifted his hand from the Huey and turned to face the approaching storm. The squeal of tires across the tarmac shattered the heavy silence like a gunshot. 3 black vehicles, polished and unyielding, skidded into formation just yards from the Huey. The heat haze rippled around them as doors flew open. Officers in starched uniforms stepped out, their faces already tense, their eyes searching for the reason they had been dragged onto the blistering runway. From the lead car, a man emerged with a presence that bent the air around him. 3 silver stars gleamed on his collar. His shoulders were square, his stride purposeful, his face carved from stone and shadow. General Michelson did not look left or right. He did not acknowledge Wells or Kramer, or the crew standing suddenly frozen like children caught in mischief. His eyes locked onto one man, the old figure in the faded jacket, standing with one hand still resting on the Huey as if steadying both the machine and the world around it. The general's boots struck the pavement in sharp rhythm, each step more terrifying than a shout. He bypassed the stunned lieutenant, ignored the pale-faced technicians, and came to a halt directly in front of Eli Vance. And then it happened. With a crack that echoed across the runway, General Michelson brought his heels together, raised his hand to his brow, and delivered a salute sharper than any he had given in his long career. His voice carried like a bell. "Mr. Vance," he said, loud enough for every technician to hear. "It is an honor to have you here, sir." The world stopped. Kramer felt his stomach twist as if the ground had fallen away beneath him. Wells instinctively snapped to attention, his throat dry, his pulse a hammer. The laughter, the jeers, the arrogance of the past hours turned to ash in the mouths of the young men who had thought themselves masters of the machine. The salute hung in the thick air, heavier than the sun, heavier than the weight of all their smugness combined. Eli Vance did not gloat. He did not smile. He returned a small nod, his eyes calm, weary, carrying more years than any of them could count. To him, this was not vindication. It was remembrance. The general lowered his hand but did not step back. His gaze swept the gathered crew like a blade. He spoke softly, but every syllable struck harder than a shout. "Do you boys have any idea who you have been mocking?" No one answered. Even the distant hum of the bass seemed to hush. "This man," Michelson continued, pointing to Eli with the authority of both memory and command, kept 60% of the 1st Cavalry Division's birds flying in the Ashau Valley in 1968. They called him the Ghost, because he could make dead machines rise again. He has more combat flight hours as a crew chief than every pilot on this base combined. Kramer's jaw slackened. Well swallowed, his skin pale as chalk. The crew shifted uneasily, their arrogance crumbling like sandcastles in a tide. The general stepped closer, his voice lowering to a dangerous growl. "When you laughed at him, when you questioned him, you weren't mocking a tired old man. You were mocking the reason men like me ever came home." Silence crushed the tarmac. No one dared to breathe. Eli lifted a hand, gentle, almost reluctant, and touched the general's sleeve. "They're just young, sir," he murmured. "They trust the lights and the screens. They haven't learned yet that machines have secrets no program can read. Don't judge them too harshly." That grace, the refusal to humiliate those who had humiliated him, cut deeper than any reprimand. The young men who had sneered now felt the burn of shame sear their pride. Peterson's chest swelled with something he couldn't name. Respect. Awe. Relief that the world still had men like this. He looked at Eli Vance and no longer saw an old man. He saw a giant cloaked in humility. The general straightened. His eyes swept Wells and Kramer again, leaving them with a verdict more terrifying than any punishment. "Remember this moment. You will carry it longer than any reprimand I could write." Then he stepped aside, clearing the path. "She's all yours, Ghost," he said. All eyes turned to Eli. The laughter was gone. The jeers were gone. Only silence remained, heavy with the weight of history about to awaken. The tarmac was still. Even the wind seemed to pause. The only sound came from the creak of leather as Eli Vance unfastened the snap on his battered pouch. The bag looked small against his weathered hands, its corners scarred and worn smooth by decades of use. To the crew it looked like junk. To Eli it was memory wrapped in hide. He reached inside and drew out a wrench that no manual had ever listed. Forged steel, blackened with age, curved at an odd angle like it had grown to fit one specific task. It gleamed faintly in the sun, not with polish, but with history. Kramer shifted uncomfortably, his arrogance draining by the second. What is that?" he muttered, but no one dared to laugh this time. Eli crouched near the engine cowling, his movements deliberate, steady, as if he had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. He brushed his fingers across the bolts of a small access panel, the same one Kramer had dismissed hours earlier as perfect. "Panels flush," Kramer whispered, defensive even now. "Torque specs are good." Eli slid the wrench into place. The custom fit was seamless, as though the metal had been waiting for this very hand. With a slow turn, the bolts surrendered without resistance, loosening with the ease of secrets being told. The old man removed the panel, exposing a nest of wires and a small hidden lever. Peterson leaned closer, his breath caught. He had worked on Hueys before in training, but he had never seen this. None of them had. "What is that?" Wells finally asked, his voice thinner than he intended. Eli's voice was quiet but sure. "A bypass. Built it in a tent with rain pouring through the seams. She was starving for fuel in high altitude. This saved her. Saved more than her." The silence that followed was deafening. None of the greenlit laptops had seen this. None of the diagnostic screens had registered it. This was knowledge born not in classrooms but in combat, where mistakes cost lives, not paperwork. Eli adjusted the lever with a careful nudge of the wrench. It clicked into place with a sound as soft as a sigh. He replaced the panel, tightened the bolts, and patted the metal once, like sealing an old promise. Then he stood, slow but unshaken, and looked to the crew. His pale eyes carried no triumph, no malice, only calm certainty. "Try her now," he said. The words rippled across the group like a commandment. No one moved at first. Finally, Kramer, face pale and hands trembling, climbed into the cockpit. He swallowed, ran through the startup sequence, his fingers suddenly clumsy. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The air grew heavier. Then a cough, a sputter, the deep whine of turbines finding breath. And then the roar. The Huey came alive with a thunder that shook the air, blades slowly turning, faster, faster, until the familiar whump 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 beat filled the base. It was the sound of history, the sound of men who had once prayed for rescue, the heartbeat of a generation. Peterson's eyes stung with tears he couldn't explain. Around him, the crew who had laughed now stood in awe, their faces lit not by screens but by shame and reverence. Wells lowered his head, throat tight. General Michelson did not smile. He simply folded his arms, watching the bird he had once trusted his life to rise again, and watching the man who had given it back its voice without fanfare or pride. Eli Vance stepped back from the Huey, his old jacket flapping in the rotor wash, his eyes steady. He wasn't celebrating. He was remembering. And in that moment, every man on the runway understood why they had called him the Ghost. The Huey's rotors thundered overhead, chopping the air into a rhythm that seemed to echo in every chest on the tarmac. The technicians, once smug and smirking, now stood frozen, their laptops forgotten, their eyes wide. The green screens that had mocked them with false reassurance only an hour earlier now seemed like toys compared to the living, roaring machine in front of them. Kramer remained in the cockpit, his hands still trembling on the controls. He had followed the checklist automatically, muscle memory guiding him, but the sound filling his ears was nothing his training had ever prepared him for. The machine had responded, not to his touch, not to the diagnostics, but to the quiet wisdom of the man they had ridiculed. He swallowed hard, staring through the canopy at the old figure standing calm in the rotor wash, jacket flapping, white hair glowing like frost in the sun. For the first time in his career, Kramer felt small, smaller than any mistake he had ever made, smaller than any manual he had memorized. He powered down slowly, the great blades ticking to a halt, and climbed out of the Huey with his head lowered. Around him, the other technicians shifted uneasily, their faces pale. No one laughed now. No one dared. Lieutenant Wells tried to speak first, but his throat tightened, words collapsing before they left his mouth. He had barked orders all day, secure in the authority of his rank, only to be stripped bare in a single moment by a man with no insignia, no command, no need for either. General Michelson broke the silence, his voice low but cutting through the air like steel. "Do you understand now?" Wells snapped to attention. "Yes, sir." The general's gaze swept over the crew, pausing on Kramer, who looked like he might sink through the concrete. "This man you mocked," the general continued, pointing at Eli, "is Elias Vance, the Ghost. In the Ashau Valley, when our birds fell faster than we could fly them, he kept them alive. He pulled men out of hell with nothing but wire, tape, and faith. He doesn't need your manuals. He wrote his own in blood." The weight of those words pressed down harder than the sun ever could. Every man on the flight line shifted, shame burning into their skin. Eli lifted a hand, quiet and calm. "They're good men, sir," he said softly. "Just young. They haven't learned yet that respect isn't printed in a book. It's earned one day at a time." The general looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. The forgiveness in Eli's tone stung more than any reprimand. Cut deeper because it left no excuses. Peterson, standing near the back, felt a lump rise in his throat. He looked at Eli with something close to reverence. The old man had endured laughter, insults, orders to leave, and had responded not with anger, but with patience. Patience that spoke louder than any display of power. Kramer finally forced himself forward. His pride felt like a lead weight in his chest. He stopped a few feet from Eli, unable to meet his eyes at first. When he did, his voice cracked. "Sir." The word felt foreign, heavier than any he'd spoken before. I was wrong. About you. About everything." Eli studied him for a moment. Then, with the faintest hint of a smile, he rested a hand on Kramer's shoulder. Not heavy, not stern, just steady. "You learned," he said simply. The words landed like absolution. Wells stepped forward next, removing his cap, something no one had expected. "Mr. Vance?" He paused, the weight of his arrogance pressing into his chest. "I owe you an apology. I forgot that rank doesn't make a man wise. Only time and sacrifice do." Eli inclined his head, accepting without gloating. "You'll remember better next time, Lieutenant. That's enough." The general watched silently, arms folded, his eyes unreadable but his heart full. He had seen battles, commands, victories, and losses, but there was something about this moment that struck deeper. It wasn't the resurrection of a machine. It was the resurrection of respect. The technicians, one by one, approached Eli. Some offered quiet apologies, others only nodded, but each gesture carried the same truth. Humility had returned to the runway. The Huey stood humming softly in the heat, alive once more. But the real resurrection had nothing to do with engines or fuel. It had happened inside the men who now looked at Eli Vance not as a relic, but as a man whose quiet strength had bridged the gap between their world and his. And in that silence, broken only by the tick of cooling metal, Peterson knew something he would carry for the rest of his career. Heroes don't demand respect. They simply live in a way that leaves you no choice but to give it. The following week, the heat of that day still lingered in the minds of everyone who had stood on the tarmac. The Patriot bell had flown, roaring to life under the touch of the man they had mocked. But what truly stayed with them wasn't the sound of the rotors. It was the sound of silence that had followed, the silence of shame, and then of newfound respect. General Michelson wasted no time. He ordered the creation of a new program across his command, the Heritage Initiative. Every new technician, every officer in training would now begin with history. Not just the manuals, not just the diagnostics, but the stories of the men and women who had kept machines alive when nothing else could. And at the heart of the first module was a photograph. A young crew chief in Vietnam, grease on his hands, determination in his eyes, Elias Vance, the ghost. For Kramer, the days after were heavy. The arrogance that once fueled his pride had collapsed into something more useful. Humility. He couldn't sleep without hearing the words, "You learned." It wasn't a condemnation. It was a gift. One evening, just before dusk, Kramer drove into town with Lieutenant Wells. Neither spoke much on the way. They didn't need to. The destination was clear. The diner sat on the corner of a quiet street, its neon sign flickering against the falling light. Through the window, they saw him, Eli Vance, sitting alone in a booth, a mug of coffee steaming between his hands, his gaze far away, as if still listening for rotor blades only he could hear. Wells hesitated at the door. He had delivered countless briefings, spoken with commanders, even addressed dignitaries, but he had never felt his voice falter the way it did now. Kramer broke the silence first. "We owe him more than words." They stepped inside, caps in hand, boots loud on the tile floor. Eli looked up as the bell over the door jingled. His pale eyes met theirs, steady, calm. "Mr. Vance?" Wells began, his throat dry. We came to apologize. For everything we said. For how we treated you. We were wrong." Kramer nodded, his voice rough. "You saved us. Not just the mission. You saved us from ourselves." Eli studied them quietly. Then he gestured to the empty seats across from him. "Sit down, boys. Coffee's on me." They slid into the booth, their caps resting on the vinyl beside them. The tension that had hung over the base seemed to lift in the warmth of that small diner. Eli took a sip from his mug, then set it down, his eyes thoughtful. "You see, machines, they're not just bolts and wires. They carry the lives of the men who ride them. They carry memories. And sometimes they need more than diagnostics. They need someone who remembers what they've been through. Neither Wells nor Kramer interrupted. They listened, really listened, for the first time. Eli's stories flowed, not in dramatic speeches, but in quiet recollections. Nights in the jungle, patching bullet holes under lantern light. Flights where the engine coughed like a dying man, but somehow kept spinning until the last soldier was lifted to safety. Moments where ingenuity and faith held the line between life and death. The sun dipped lower outside, shadows stretching across the floor. The men leaned in, caught not by the technical details, but by the lessons woven into every memory. Resilience, humility, respect for the past. When Eli finally paused, the diner was nearly empty. He looked at them both with tired kindness. Someday you'll have young men laughing at you too. Don't be quick to anger. Let them laugh. And then, when the time comes, show them. Not with pride, with patience. The words sank deeper than any reprimand ever could. Kramer felt the knot in his chest loosen. Wells nodded slowly, as if carving the lesson into his very bones. Outside, the night had fallen. The street lamps flickered to life, and somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of an aircraft engine rolled across the sky. For Peterson, who sat a few booths away nursing a soda, scribbling notes he hadn't yet admitted he was taking, one thing was clear. This story, this lesson, would outlive them all. And so the laughter that had once mocked an old man was replaced by something far greater. A legacy of respect, carried forward like the steady whump 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 of rotor blades echoing across generations. Elias Vance wasn't just a mechanic. He wasn't just a veteran. He was living proof that true strength is measured not in rank or ribbons, but in humility, patience, and sacrifice. On that day, the technicians laughed at him. But when the Huey roared to life, when the general raised his hand in salute, the laughter turned into silence, and that silence became respect. And maybe that's the lesson we're meant to carry forward. Technology changes, uniforms change, even wars change. But honor never goes out of style. If the story moved you, don't let it fade. Hit like, share it with friends who need to hear it, and subscribe to Endless Stories, because every veteran's story deserves to be remembered, and we're here to make sure they are.